Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the 2014 Academy of Social Sciences Fay Gale Lecture. My name's Ray Francis. I'm the Dean of Arts here at Monash, and it's my great pleasure to be your MC for this evening. And before we begin our formal proceedings, of course, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered tonight on the lands of the Kulin Nation, and I wish to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge that we have a few distinguished people amongst us, well, particularly distinguished. We're all very distinguished. We have Professor Peter Sperrett, who's here representing the Academy. He's the Chair of the Public Forums and Communication Committee. We have from Monash University, Zlatko Skilbus, the Vice Provost for Graduate Education, Daryl Evans, Vice Provost for Learning and Teaching. We also have Professor Sharon Pickering, who's the Head of the School of Social Sciences, and we have a number of Fellows of the Academy of Social Sciences, Jim Walter, Terry Seddon, Verity Bergman and Lynette Russell. I'm not going to take up any more of the time that you've come to hear Jacqui True speak, so I'm going to hand over to Peter Sperrett, who's going to say a few words about the Fay Gale Lecture and about our speaker tonight. So, Peter.
Thank you, Ray. Well, obviously this lecture honours the late Professor Fay Gale, who was the first honours graduate in geography from the University of Adelaide and went on to become an eminent human geographer. It won't amaze you to hear that when we had the Fay Gale Lecture in Adelaide last year, my dining companions were all of the female gender and are very well informed about local vineyards. Fay was well known for her contributions to academia, the advancement of women, Indigenous studies and juvenile justice. She received an Order of Australia in 1989. She was also the first female president of the Academy of Social Sciences. She was the president from 1997 to 2000, and she served as the Vice Chancellor of the University of Western Australia from 1990 to 1997. So in honour of Fay's contributions to both the Academy of Social Sciences and wider social science interests, the Academy supports a distinguished female social scientist to present the Fay Gale Lecture, and it's always presented in two venues, often the home university of the social scientist, in this case obviously Monash for Jacqui, and it's also presented each year in Adelaide, hence my remark about well-informed women on local wineries. Okay. Jacqui True is Professor of Politics and International Relations at Monash University, and she'll be known to most of you here, obviously. She did her PhD in Political Science from York University in Canada. She's previously taught at Michigan State, the University of Southern California, and the University of Auckland. So in conversation with Jacqui just now, I've discovered that I already knew that New Zealand didn't have snakes, but she was explaining to me that one of the reasons why she likes living near the sea is that New Zealand doesn't have big bushfires. So that's the kind of thing you want to learn at a social science lecture. Jacqui True has published extensively in the field of gender and international relations. Her current research is focused on the UN Women, Peace and Security agenda. Her book, The Political Economy of Violence Against Women, was published by Oxford in 2012 and won the American Political Science Association's Biennial Prize for the best book on human rights. It's always delightful to introduce a social scientist who still writes a book, because I had occasion recently to have a look at this extraordinary list of allegedly important journals ranked by the deans of business in Australia. And I don't know whether any of you have ever looked at the ABCD Dean's business list, but books of course aren't regarded as legitimate publications by deans of business. I hadn't realised that. So it was with great pleasure that I invite Jacqui True to address us tonight to give this Fay Gale Lecture. Jacqui.
So as Peter's told us, she was the first woman president of the Academy of Social Sciences. Now, with respect to being a first in her field of international relations, I'm reminded of Cynthia Enlow's comment that if by chance one becomes a first, it is more useful to dispel any false notions about one's specialness and instead use the new position to make it clear that there are lots of others who deserve to be in the alleged club. That one should not be a model as such, for that might actually close the door rather than open it wider. Fay Gale seems to have approached all her roles with the purpose of not just opening doors, but lifting them off their hinges for groups previously excluded. So this lecture is dedicated to her memory and takes up her spirit of exploration and investigating experiences such as those of mixed heritage Aborigines that no one before imagined were worthy of investigation. So tonight I want to talk about violence, how we can understand patterns of violence globally and across history with the central purpose of preventing and ending all forms of violence and harm to human beings. The task of theorising global violence and ascertaining its rise and decline is increasingly the focus of much social science scholarship. And my point tonight is not to morally or analytically equate all forms of violence, violent deaths, for instance, with egregious harms or injuries during war or peace, but to reveal the connections between these forms of violence as a continuum of violence. I argue that if we want to stop violence, then we need to look at its forms, all its forms, as well as its root causes. Let me start by talking about the work I have been doing. In 1993, the United Nations General Assembly ratified the UN Declaration on Violence Against Women. This was the culmination of 2 decades of advocacy. To make visible often hidden, silenced and ignored harms affecting women and girls in particular, activists grouped together a range of different forms of violence under the umbrella of violence against women and girls. This was also an attempt to provide a universal framing of the experiences and the causes of violence, stating that these were different for men and women. Article 1 of the Declaration defines violence against women as this, and I quote, "Any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual or psychological harm or suffering to women, including threats of such acts, coercion or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or in private life." And the preamble to that declaration recognises, among other things, that violence against women is a manifestation of historically unequal power relations between men and women, which have led to the domination over and discrimination against women by men, and to the prevention of the full advancement of women. And that violence against women, importantly, and this is a quote, is one of the crucial social mechanisms by which women are forced into a subordinate position compared with men. End quote. My own work on the political economy of violence against women builds on this common definition and global movement to recognise myriad forms of violence previously deemed acceptable and outside of law and justice as violence against women and girls. I've sought to provide a framing of the common, increasingly globalised structures that enable and in combination cause various forms of harm to women and girls, including physical violence, but also psychological and economic violence. I argue in the political economy of violence against women that globalised economic cycles of boom and bust exacerbate gendered inequalities in society and escalate the risk factors for violence against women. That is, mortgage foreclosures, austerity policies, job losses, especially in the state sector where women are disproportionately employed, financial and psychological stress affecting drug and alcohol abuse, and poverty all make women and girls vulnerable to men's violence. Some men lash out to sustain masculine breadwinner identities in a competitive globalising economy. Macroeconomic policies can be seen as violent in their effects, and they are devised disproportionately by Western male elites and situate many women in precarious forms of bodywork, where they are frequently the subjects of abuse and exploitation. The denial of equal economic rights and status, political voice and access to public space relative to men in every country in the world makes women especially vulnerable to physical violence. So in this respect, private sphere domestic violence is both a form of political violence and a precondition for more visible violence against women that we've seen, for example, in recent times with reported gang rapes on public transport in India and sexual harassment in street protests, political protests in Egypt. Well, central to feminist studies of international relations, the field that has informed all my work has been the examination of all forms of violence, not just that perpetrated by and between states. Feminist methodology requires us to continually ask, what violence can we not see? And what forms are neglected, silent, and or marginalised in public and scholarly accounts? Non-feminist scholars have begun to consider the truly global scope of violence, seeking to examine the interconnections among different forms of violence, interpersonal, communal, one-sided, and interstate. Feminists have been long researching how all these forms of violence are gendered and how they are derived and fueled by socially constructed gendered identities, by masculinized institutions and structures that normalise aggression and violence. But now the mainstream is paying attention. The question is what it means when mainstream scholars and organisations begin to take the gendered nature of global violence seriously. Well, this lecture tonight is organised into three main parts. And I'm going to start by dissecting the thesis that we have won the war on war. That war and violence have never been as low as they are today. I'll focus here mainly on Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker's 2011 book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. Though there's a broader genre that I'm speaking to here, including Joshua Goldstein, Ian Morris, and Jared Diamond's recent books. Pinker wants a grand theory of global violence, but he only wants us to use rigorous quantitative data, which suits his purposes to show the longitudinal decline of violence. For a theory that explains this decline, he deploys a hackneyed approach, evolutionary sociobiology, not considering the range of social science approaches. It's laudable to want to understand this big picture of violence, but it's unforgivable to build an ambition on sand. In Pinker's book, that sand is incomplete quantitative data, mostly focused on war deaths in the 20th century and US reported homicides. Such an approach, I would argue, and remembering my graduate days in political science, is akin to the methodological metaphor of looking for the car keys where the lamppost is, but not where you lost them. So the second part of the talk, I want to consider the neglect of violence against women and girls in the declinist account. In particular, the failure to see that violent deaths are part of a much wider continuum of violence that I coined the political economy of violence. The focus on decline in per capita violent deaths imports a gender bias. It renders invisible the harms to women and girls that occur outside of official war, the harms to women and girls that are indirectly related to conflict, and that may result in significant injury, but not in death, which is where they are most likely to occur. In the third part of the talk, I consider the implications of the good news story that violence is in sharp decline. And I ask, what would a feminist accounting or counting of global violence look like? And how could we do better research that more fully comprehends the patterns of violence with the chief purpose of preventing and ending that violence? Above all, I proffer that no analysis of the causes of violence and war, nor of their purported historical decline, can be adequate or complete without a feminist perspective. So let me start by putting this in the context of the proliferation of declinist arguments about war, that we're winning the war on war. So in his 2011 book, Steven Pinker makes the case that violence has dramatically declined up to the present, and that the norms of non-violence are now well entrenched. Like sociologist Norbert Elias and international relations theorist Andrew Linklater, who taught me at Monash University all those years ago, he further argues that this is a non-random direction of history, amounting to a form of moral progress. To make visible the history of forgotten violence, to show that we are all pacifists and feminists now, Pinker uses per capita rates of violent death to empirically prove his case. That is, he's not saying violence has declined absolutely, he's saying it's declined in terms of sheer numbers. No, he's not saying it's declined in terms of sheer numbers, but relative to our population. So Pinker and Goldstein, in his book, Winning the War on War, examine the rates of violent deaths in state systems compared with non-state societies. And their claim for decline is made with this graph here. The graph shows that there were approximately 524 violent deaths per 100,000 in non-state societies, compared with 60 such deaths per 100,000 people in state societies. That's pretty much the last kind of numbers I'm going to give. So you can see that difference there. And on the basis of that, they also argue, looking at the 20th century war deaths, that just 3% of the world population were killed in the first half of the 20th century in the two world wars. And so on the basis of those two kind of graphs, essentially, they kind of basically conclude that no more than approximately 1/4 of the deaths in the 20th century in state systems have been occurring relative to tribal societies. And I might just add here, as I did a little bit of research on this, that pre-colonial Indigenous violence overshadows, indeed blacks out colonial violence and genocide in this story, but that is another lecture. And there are a number of Aboriginal conflicts actually counted in the tribal societies. So Pinker hones in more closely to examine the homicide rates in England and Western Europe since the 14th century. And this is the graph here that Pinker said he inspired him to write the book, and that he thinks is absolutely stunning. What is stunning is what this graph leaves out. It's based on Ted Gurr's, political scientist, research depicting homicide declining from 110 per 100,000 people per year in the 14th century to 1 per 100,000 in mid-20th century London. Pinker notes as an aside that stranger homicide declined far more rapidly than has the killing of children, spouses, parents and siblings. But this data, or line of inquiry, is not further explored in the book. So violence in Pinker's 5-century account has declined as a result of 5 developments, and that have driven a broader pacification process. And these developments, I'm just going to list them briefly, and then I'm going to focus on one. They are the historical centralisation of state power, the liberalisation of commerce, the expanding circle, and that's wherein people come to value other people's interests the same as their own. Fourth, the escalation of reason, and that is where IQs have been gradually rising in the 20th century due to the increasing use mainly of abstract rather than concrete argument. And the fifth development is feminisation. And let me focus on this process because Pinker suggests it's got a lot to do with the decrease in violence. So Pinker disaggregates feminisation into 4 processes associated with the decline in violence. The first is the direct political empowerment of women. The second is the deflation of manly honour. Third is the promotion of marriage on women's terms. And fourth, the rights of girls to be born, together with women's rights to determine their own reproductive capacities. Pinker states that the one great universal, indeed the most fundamental empirical generalisation in the study of violence, is that most of it is committed by 15 to 30-year-old men. So, masculinity and gender matter hugely to understanding the problem of global violence, despite the lack of attention to those outside of feminist scholarship. But Pinker uses an essentialist biologist argument and suggests that violence is a problem of too many men, too many males, especially too many young males. I'd like to quote him at length here, and I almost quoted it to my sons to see what they think, but I might try that later. So you can read it and I'll read along. From the time they are boys, and I'll try to pretend to be Pinker, who's also on YouTube doing a TED talk, males play more violently than females, fantasise more about violence, consume more violent entertainment, commit the lion's share of violent crimes, take more delight in punishment and revenge. take more foolish risks in aggressive attacks, vote for more warlike policies and leaders, and plan and carry out almost all wars and genocides. Even when the sexes overlap, and the difference between their averages is small, we are told, the difference can decide a close election or set off a spiral of belligerence in which each side has to be a bit more bellicose than the other. Historically, women have taken the leadership in pacifist and humanitarian movements out of proportion to their influence in other political institutions of their time. And recent decades, in which women and their interests have had unprecedented influence in all walks of life, apparently, are also the decades in which wars between developed states became increasingly unthinkable. End quote. So the conflation of men and violence and women with peace in this excerpt is striking. It flies in the face of 3 decades of scholarship disentangling these as social constructions, and very harmful social constructions at that. Not least because associating peace with women, femininity, emotion, which have been historically devalued, makes the negotiation of peace seem like the lesser and weaker option than pursuing a violent military strategy. However, this gendered conflation of violence and masculinity is strongly supported by evolutionary psychological theory. In Sex and World Peace, the title of this book by Valerie Hudson and her co-authors, and I just have to note here, it's on my bookshelf, and my sons have asked me, did you feel embarrassed when you bought that book at the bookshop, Mum? And I said, it's not about that. But they're not here tonight to learn that. Anyway, in Sex and World Peace, we see the same evolutionary perspective on violent masculinity and states that fail to constrain that masculinity, harbouring high levels of gender inequality. This perspective is deployed as a theoretical explanation for why some states go to war. In another piece, in a 2012 article by Valerie Hudson and her co-authors, feminist evolutionary analysis, which they term it, is used to explain why men perpetrate violence against their female intimate partners. In that article, they argue that the major cause of violence against women is male-female conflict over biological reproduction, and that conflict is mirrored in inequitable family laws historically, and it's especially present in countries with plural justice systems and majority Muslim populations. In short, evolutionary theory claims that men are driven to dominate, even rape, women and girls in order to reproduce their genes. Sexism, Pinker writes, and I quote him, ultimately arises from the genetic incentive of men to control the behaviour, especially the sexual behaviour of women. Men are more likely to dominate and rape in societies where there's a shortage of women and girls. Yet, in China and India, where the sex ratio is skewed not by virtue of biological drives, but due to culturally and socially sanctioned female infanticide and those societies' privileging of boys and men. As a result, Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen uncovered the 100 million missing girls in China, South Asia, and West Asia in his 1990 essay. But Pinker goes on, and I quote him, social dominance is a guy thing. Men are more dominance-obsessed gender with stronger tribalist feelings than women, including racism, militarism, and comfort with inequality. And Hudson adds that the shift to monogamy and a universal secular system of law lessens violence because it removes, quote, the reproductive jackpot, end quote, for men, and therein constrains their aggressive behaviour. No offence to all the men in the room who are probably feeling a little uncomfortable at this point. Both scholars argue that women are a civilising influence, socialising men into better behaviour across place and history, be that as marriage partners in medieval Europe, as nurses on the Western frontier, or contemporary political leaders in foreign affairs. And the military, I found this nice picture. And I showed it to my colleagues in Los Angeles. So it's actually California. So, well, Francis Fukuyama's thesis that wimpy women leaders potentially threaten the security of the globe is thoroughly discounted here by Pinker. He extensively cites the psychological and behavioural economics research findings on gender gaps and overconfidence, and affirms the feminisation thesis that the world would be more peaceful if these women were in charge. I'm not saying he doesn't have a point. He qualifies his argument noting that when women had to worry about abduction, rape and infanticide by the enemy, of course, they supported their men on the winning side of war. As the readers of the book, we're told that in the 21st century, we no longer have to worry about abduction, intersexual slavery, divinely commanded genocide, the prospect of nuclear world war putting an end to civilization and human life itself. And that, quote, even more revolutionary than the scorn for violence today between men is the scorn for violence against women. Really? There are 23 state and non-state armed groups on the Secretary-General's sanctions list where the perpetration of systematic sexual violence is documented. Do citizens of those states, those 23 states, have to worry about abduction, rape, slavery and infanticide? Nigeria is not on that list. But the 276 schoolgirls abducted by Boko Haram on April 14th and threatened to be killed or sold into marriage because, in the words of their leader, women are slaves, suggest that for parents and school children in that country, the fear of abduction is not a mere subject of history. There may be scorn also for 22-year-old Elliot Rodgers' misogyny-driven alleged murder 2 weeks ago of the 6 young people in his shared house and in the sorority house at the University of California, Santa Barbara. But there is no end to the violence against women and girls. As the Domestic Violence Resource Centre Victoria said last week, whether in the context of a violent intimate partnership, post-rejection stalking, opportunistic street attacks, kidnapping schoolgirls, or a hate-filled killing spree, as in this case, gendered violence is violence. And yes, all women have had enough. But that violence is apparently not worthy of investigation. Pinker is categorical. A world in which women have more influence will be a world with fewer wars. Let me now turn more explicitly to the neglect of sexual and gender-based violence in declinist accounts of war. So social science research that argues violence has declined with reference to historical and quantitative data that I've showed has almost completely neglected the quantitative and qualitative evidence of violence against women and girls. This is despite the nearly 4 decades of violence against women scholarship, activism and policy interventions. Sexual and gender-based violence has been largely invisible and unreported in historical accounts and data, although contemporary prevalence surveys reveal many girls and women in every country have experienced this form of violence. So according to the Cross-National International Violence Against Women survey, which is often cited when people talk about 1 in 3 women have experienced violence by either sexual violence or violence by an intimate partner, that survey shows the number of women who have experienced at least one incident of physical or sexual violence since the age of 16 is between 20 and 60%, with an average victimisation rate globally of over 35%. So the neglect of this gendered violence in the global history of violence is partly due to the reliance on quantitative analysis of reported incidents and the privileging of violent deaths over other harms simply because they are easier to count. And this is exemplified in the 2012 Human Security Report's trivialising of conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence. And I want to explore these 2 issues further now. So just in terms of weighing the quantum of violence and the quantum of violence against women, men's violence is the single greatest cause of death for women aged 15 to 44 in many countries, more than cancer, car accidents, war, conflict or natural disasters. The ABC reported on May 6th, and the Age editorial on May 20th here in Melbourne stated that the leading contributor to death and long-term poor health among Victorian women in this age group is violence in the home or within an intimate relationship. Globally, if we count all the forms of violence against women and girls listed in the United Nations Declaration, it would exceed all the deaths from war in the 20th century. Now, this is again not to morally equate these deaths, but just to give an example of the gaps in our data and awareness. In our state of Victoria, the crime rate, and I'm glad to have some criminologists in the audience, the crime rate's rising largely due to increased domestic violence or increased reporting of that domestic violence. More than a third of all crimes against the person committed in the 2012-13 year were related to family violence. In the year to the end of June 2013, police attended 61,000 family violence incidents in Victoria and 49,000 resulted in a person being charged. In the past 10 years in Victoria, family violence related to crime against the person has increased by nearly 400%, mainly due to increase in assaults and increased reporting. And the large majority of these crimes are perpetrated by men against women. Similar increases in violence against women and girls have been registered in many countries. And wherever I would speak this lecture, I would change the data wherever I was. And this is in the context of decreasing rates of other types of crime. Indeed, compared to war and interstate violence, there's very little evidence that rates of violence against women and girls are decreasing, despite declinist claims. And while there is some evidence of decrease, such as in reported rape and sexual violence in the United States, Pinker reports this evidence rather than the accounts from the United Nations or from the World Health Organization or from police reporting of domestic and family violence in non-conflict countries and humanitarian agencies' field reports from conflict-affected zones. Homicides and battle deaths are the preferred database for testing the decline of violence thesis by Pinker and by Goldstein, because they appear to prove their thesis and they are apparently more rigorous counts. They look only for the data and trends that point in the downward direction, deliberately overlooking contrary data and not exploring qualitative data, because that data is not reliable. Pinker states, and I'm going to quote him again, homicide data is more reliable than records of rape, assault, and they usually correlate with them, we're told. He admits it's not easy to tell which rates of violence against women are what they are, but at the same time he tells us advocacy groups tend to inflate statistics on rates of violence against women and to hide statistical trends over time. Numerous proclamations have been made from bully pulpits such as the United Nations, I quote Pinker. And according to him, the World Health Organization has published a hodgepodge of rates of serious domestic violence from 48 countries. So, as you can tell from the tone of my voice, there are, of course, good reasons themselves about violent oppression, why we don't have perfect data on domestic violence and other forms of violence against women and girls. This violence is often not counted, recorded, or reported because many women and girls experience it as extremely shameful. Admitting to being a victim of sexual and gender-based violence, including being a victim of violence perpetrated by a male relative, carries a major social stigma in every country, though to differing degrees. Here the violence is not just physical, but psychological, cultural, and economic. And it relates to the coercive power of individuals, states, and other collectivities to belittle and reduce the equal status and voice of female human beings, such that they don't know they have basic human rights, let alone the right to claim them. According to Pinker, systematic atrocities against women are rare or unheard of in the 21st century West. And the atrocities he includes here are infanticide, genital mutilation, trafficking in child prostitutes and sex slaves, honour crimes, mass rapes during wars, riots and genocides. Now, it's true that these estimates of these gendered atrocities are just that, estimates, and that counting sexual and gender-based violence is not an exact science. But to say that these forms of violence are unheard of or rare in Western societies beggars belief. Crimes such as honour killings, child trafficking, forced and early marriage, gang rape are all present in Western societies and perpetrated by Western actors. And it's a huge problem that violence documented by social and health services, by humanitarian organisations that are not currently quantified or officially counted, recorded or reported are ignored by social scientists of the calibre of Pinker, and not only that, considered to be non-existent, rare or unheard of. Let me give a recent example from Auckland, New Zealand, in our neighbourhood, not just because I used to live there. And this is an example of the failure of police to record and prosecute the systematic targeting of girls for sexual violence, and how that failure compounds the counting problem. So the Auckland police learned about the gang rape of girls as young as 13 and 14 in a West Auckland suburb, middle-class suburb, by a group of older teenage boys called Roast Busters via Facebook. They roast the girls by getting them drunk, and then they bust them. The New Zealand Police Commissioner stated that the boys aged 17 to 18 years would not be prosecuted because apparent victims had not been brave enough to testify. It later turned out that the police had received reports 2 years before, and that they knew about the pictures of the acts on Facebook. In fact, they told a 13-year-old girl reporting the alleged crime at the time that she didn't have enough evidence. In her words, they told her, quote, "I went out in clothes I was pretty much asking for it." This state failure to provide victim rights to justice precipitated protest marches of thousands around New Zealand in 2013. And this is just one from Wellington. This example reveals a cruel paradox affecting violence against women and girls, that violence extends to the fear of trivialising messages from police and of shaming from public figures, which is what stops women and girls from reporting in the first place. This is a paradox that Pinker and other declinists don't notice, and therefore don't feel they need to account for in their grand telling of the fall in violence. Turning to the debate on sexual violence and conflict, declinist perspectives on violence and war run counter to contemporary reporting of this violence and contemporary conflicts. Conflict-related sexual violence has received increasing global attention following a slew of United Nations Security Council resolutions since 2000, but also a G8 leaders statement in 2012, and the United Kingdom government's launch of a global initiative to prevent sexual violence. And the UK is hosting the largest ever global summit to end the use of rape and other sexual violence as a weapon of war next week in London. Okay, you can see the time to act is their hashtag. This global attention is actually an achievement of several decades of struggle by women's movements around the world to have gendered violence recognised as violence. Here in Australia, and I thank Christina Twomey for her citations here, around 300 Sydney women went to court in 1983 to secure their right to protest on Anzac Day against the use of rape in all wars. They were denied this right and imprisoned on the grounds that their protest, their other war story, would defame the honour of Anzac soldiers. 15 years later, in 1998, the Rome Statute that established the International Criminal Court legally recognised for the first time that widespread and systematic sexual violence is a war crime, a crime against humanity, and potentially a crime of genocide. But today, the 2012 Human Security Report states that conflict-related sexual violence declines when the number and deadliness of conflicts declines. And this is despite the fact that existing data sets, for instance, the Uppsala conflict data set, doesn't include even incomplete reported data on sexual violence. So why would we make that assumption that sexual violence in conflict is declining because the number and deadliness of conflicts are declining? Well, Professor Andrew Mack, formerly of the ANU and author of the Human Security Report, dismisses the UN Secretary-General's annual Women Peace Security Reports on sexual violence and conflicts. He says, quote, "Ban Ki-moon has no idea of the number of acts being committed in these conflicts," end quote. The report contradicts itself. On the one hand, Mack argues that there's no good comparative data on sexual and gender-based violence in conflict. But then on the other hand, he claims to know that it's not as prevalent as claimed by those self-serving NGOs, but as being reported, simply being reported more often. And I should say that the determination of widespread and systematic sexual violence by the International Criminal Court has nothing to do with numbers. Happy to talk more about that later. That there may be no rigorous quantitative data on systematic sexual and gender-based violence means the case is not proven either way. It does not mean we have no knowledge whatsoever. Reporting in armed conflict-affected or near-conflict-affected countries is extremely poor and unreliable for a number of reasons, due to weak law and justice systems, known underreporting of abuses in remote and rural areas, to shame that I spoke about, and to the danger of reporting in cases where such violence is deployed to oppressed groups. Given these issues, we simply cannot attribute all recorded increases to an increase in reporting. And neither the Human Security Report nor Steven Pinker cite the significant feminist social science on the serious problem of underreporting of rape and sexual violence, or the reasons for it, in a range of conflict and developing country contexts, let alone in Western countries. Indeed, the Human Security Report excludes most qualitative field reports. For instance, reports on sexual and gender-based violence against women and girls in Syria and among Syrian refugees in Lebanon were published a year before that country was listed by the UN Secretary General as perpetrating systematic sexual violence. So it's true that these reports from NGOs don't aggregate, but they do tell us a lot about the gendered contexts of violence in conflict areas, and they tell us a lot more than does quantitative incidence or prevalence survey data. So for instance, the June 2012 NGO report on Syria documented how fear of sexual violence was leading women and girls to flee their homes and cross borders, and leading families to sell their daughters into early marriage to wealthy Lebanese, Jordanian men. In specific contexts, moreover, large data sets and regression analyses are not going to be able to help with the prevention of violence and early warning of conflict. But MAC and the Human Security Report make a leap of faith that gendered violence could not be possibly increasing, and nor could it be of a magnitude or significance that threatens international security and peace. And Pinker, whose case for decline rests largely on selected American data, makes a similar spurious claim when he states that it's safe to guess, it's a social scientist speaking, it's safe to guess, he says that similar declines have taken place in other Western democracies because domestic violence has been a concern in all of them. Indeed, he concludes, though elsewhere I have been chary about making predictions, I think it's extremely likely that in the coming decades, violence against women will decrease throughout the world. I wish I had his confidence. But the purpose of the Better Angels of Our Nature and the Human Security Report is not to improve data collection on the ground or to improve research, but rather to imply that they should not demand, that sexual and gender-based violence should not demand emergency responses or be considered human security issues, and most certainly not by international actors such as the United Nations and the United Nations Security Council. So now I've come to the third and final part of the lecture. Have we truly won the war and on violence? What are the implications of that thesis, that there has been a decline, for efforts to bring about less violent social relations, and for the awareness of violence against women and girls and efforts to address that violence within and across societies? Well, many international relations scholars have pointed to the changing meaning of violent conflict in the 21st century, but declinist accounts fail to comprehend this. Yesterday, at the Australian Dialogue on Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict at Parliament House, Foreign Minister Julie Bishop, in her address, stated that individual civilians, often individual women and children, are more than 8 times as likely to be killed in conflict as so-called combatants. And that ratio was reversed in the first half of the 20th century in the world wars. So the thesis that historically war and violent fatalities have never been as low as they are today fails to examine these changes in the nature of conflict and the qualitative analysis of how that violent conflict is gendered. And in so doing, the thesis has a negative impact on our capacity to raise awareness about existing and new forms of violence and to be able to reduce and prevent them. Let me just take a moment to talk about Afghanistan. The news headlines over the past 6 months make for harrowing reading. Let me just read a few of those headlines. Woman axed to death in Baghdad. Pregnant teacher and policewoman hanged. Man guns down wife. Sorry, it's always really hard to read these things. Woman beaten to death by husband. Female parliamentarian kidnapped, and on it goes. The evidence from 2013 is shocking. That everyday violence includes targeted femicide of women in public roles by Taliban. Now, in the UN Secretary General's November 2013 report on the protection of civilians, it's noted that in the first half of 2013, the number of women killed and injured increased by 61% compared with the same period in 2012. The Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission reported the alarming increase in civilian casualties last year, with women and children civilians making up nearly half of the deaths and injuries, and that's not including the reported or unreported domestic violence. So basically, as the Taliban returns to Afghanistan and increases the presence of fundamentalism, every male relative is empowered to basically lash out against wives, daughters, and sisters with impunity. Now, at the same time as this one-sided violence is occurring in Afghanistan, you have other movements worldwide, and US women's movements have coined the expression, the war on women. And that is to describe how certain political groupings in the United States seek to impose a limited vision for women's human rights and autonomy on an entire polity. And here they are particularly speaking about reproductive rights and access to contraception and abortion. The War on Women campaign has also shown that contemporary violence against women is exacerbated by austerity economic policies. So while increasing the risks and the determinants of violence, which I discussed at the beginning, austerity policies everywhere in the so-called Anglosphere, the United Kingdom, Canada, New Zealand and Australia, are removing services for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. And New South Wales is the latest Australian state to close down 20 shelters for victims of domestic violence in the last month. So there appears to be a spontaneous agreement on the part of political leaders in those countries on the need to keep women in their place, recalling the UN Declaration on Violence and the purpose of that violence. We used to call that patriarchy. The point here is that analysing violence across the centuries, as does Pinker, Goldstein and others, doesn't enable us to assess whether interventions in our lifetime or the political time of governments is having an effect on reducing today's violent crimes. We're now living in a period worldwide of neoconservatism and in many countries economic recession and government austerity. And to the extent that this context is disenfranchising many populations and citizens, affecting the economic security, employment and financial stress of individuals and families, and given what we know about the determinants of violent crime, including men's violence against women, we can expect there will be an impact. And it will be likely an increase in this violence without any mitigating measures. So, what are the alternatives to picking a single data point on violence and claiming that all violence is diminishing? If we agree there's an imperative to understand and explain global patterns of violence, what would a feminist social science account or counting of global violence look like? How could we do better research that comprehends all the forms of violence with the purpose of ending it? I think there are several ways forward to being more systematic. Currently, the failure to properly examine and explain current trends of violence against women and girls is due to the hodgepodge of data that Pinker refers to, and also due to the fascination with numbers, as opposed to other forms of analysis and understanding. So rather than assume that there's no good data on violence against women and girls, or that no reporting is equivalent to no violence, if we're concerned with prevention, we should be trying harder to understand the data we have and piece it together, or to actually create new data sets. Continued progress in the apparent decline in violence and war will need to elevate the status of qualitative data on violence and the gendered experiences of violence and put these on a par with quantitative data sets. This could be done by systematising and comparing qualitative data sets built from the ground up in different contexts, converting them into regional indexes of violence, and other formats that enable us to accurately weigh the quantum of gendered violence and its significance. Here, the often myriad, hidden, invisible war stories, including those that have not gained prominence in the post-war telling, like those of rape and war, but also of the trauma of war and its aftermath for those who fought and those who didn't, these will need to be incorporated. I can imagine data sets, not only of battle deaths, but that count the continuum of violence, of intimate partner violence prevalence in conflict-affected settings, of data sets that disaggregate and open up who is a combatant, data sets that quantify disease and household poverty after conflict, to give some examples of the kinds of data that we would want to bring together. But we should also connect this counting or quantitative data to real stories of those who have been victims or perpetrators of violence and who are not just numbers, in the way that Renata Kolkunovic and her team at Monash have been doing with patient experiences of depression and mental illness. And another example of this is Sarah Brown from Clark University, who's just produced life narratives from the first interviews with 4 women perpetrators of ethnic genocide in Rwanda 20 years ago. Another model to be applauded and diffused potentially is Karen Ngala-Smith's UK Femicide Index and her campaign titled Counting Dead Women. She works to detect violence against women and girls buried in news reports, death notices, and also statistics that tend to minimise the scale and significance of male violence against women. She publicises these new statistics of women victims of male violence through social media campaigns and includes the stories of the women killed that helps to explicate the causes of the violence linked to masculinist cultures of misogyny and the political and economic disempowerment of women. Australia could develop such a similar femicide index, and that has been already suggested by Adrian Howe in the Griffith Review. And I think this approach also has a precedent here in the Gender Disaggregated Australian Border Deaths database established by Sharon Pickering and Leanne Webber at Monash. We will also need to systematically count and analyse the root causes of the silenced and accepted gendered violence increasingly being discussed around the world. I'll give you another picture. This means we're going to have to collect data on a range of factors or variables affecting violence, as well as the incidents of violence themselves, starting with rich analysis of single case studies. And this is the Australian Research Council project I'm engaged in with Sarah Davies, also Sarah Meagher here today, on the use of sexual violence in the Asia-Pacific region. I would also recommend focusing on qualitative research that seeks to understand and to change the gendered social construction of violent identities and complex masculinised institutions, following Cynthia Enlow's groundbreaking work. And these institutions might include Citibank and all financial investment houses. They might include the University of California, Santa Barbara, and all institutions of higher education. They might include the Collingwood Football Club and all institutions of men's sports. Apologies to those who support us. The Australian Defence College and all military training institutions, and also the Australian House of Representatives and all legislative and political institutions globally. So to conclude, I'd like to leave you with this key message. We may be winning the war on interstate war, but we're currently losing the battle on preventing and ending violence. The predilection for studying only violent deaths and war distracts us from the broader violence in our homes, our cities, communities, and in apparently non-conflict situations outside of official war. The struggle of the 21st century should be to universalise the patterns of decline in violence and war observed by Pinker, Goldstein, Morris, Diamond and others across every sphere in every society. But this demands that we seriously scrutinise all forms of violence, including the violence against women and girls, and that we not assume that the logic of civilisation will reduce all forms of violence equally and at the same time. Ending sexual and gender-based violence and ending war must go together, and we can't focus just on ending war or making war safe for women, as is the case of the UN Security or the UK's focus on ending sexual violence in conflict, whilst cutting services to victims of sexual violence in their own country. As social scientists, we have a challenge and an opportunity. If we could provide a less flawed and more complete accounting of violence that makes visible its gendered nature, its changing dynamics, and the factors exacerbating it, then we could begin to design, pilot, and spread interventions that can actually have an impact on reducing violence. I think whole new research agendas would be opened up that could bring about major change if we could do this. We could start by joining up the existing data, converting qualitative data into quantifiable and readily monitored indexes, as I've suggested, and collecting new data with new forensic technologies and with the use of new social media networks. Building that evidence base to better understand how violence works and how to address the underside of civilization and globalization, I think is one of the most important directions for social science in the next 50 years. We will win the war on war, but we will lose the battle to improve the human condition if we do not take seriously the collective challenge to systematically count and account for the myriad forms and structural causes of violence. And we will lose that battle if we do not recognise that while violence may have multiple causes, it is always and everywhere a problem of gender, a point upon which Pinker and I agree. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqui, for that incredibly well-informed and thought-provoking lecture. And I now invite Lynette Russell, who was my co-nominator for this lecture this evening, to make a few concluding remarks.
Jacqui, do you want, where are you? Do you want to come on? Peter, did you I think we all agree that Jacqui's lecture tonight was incredibly stimulating and challenging and a little bit disturbing. Thank you so much, Jacqui. I've found it really amazing and I've learned a great deal from it. Having read Pinker's book, struggled through all 800 pages, you've put it into some great perspective. So I appreciate it immensely personally, and I'm sure the audience has had a great time too. So,
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much for coming.
And now the best part of the evening, really. I invite you all to join us for drinks. Thank you again for your attendance.